Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Human Flourishing in an Age of Gene Editing, edited by Erik Parens and Josephine Johnston, narrated by Chris Sorensen and Wendy Tremont King. Disclaimer: this material is not intended to be and should not be considered a substitute for medical or other professional advice. Treatment for the conditions described in this material is highly dependent on the individual circumstances. And while this material is designed to offer accurate information with respect to the subject matter covered, and to be current as of the time it was written, research and knowledge about medical and health issues is constantly evolving, and dose schedules for medications are being revised continually, with new side effects recognized and accounted for regularly. Listeners must therefore always check the product information and clinical procedures with the most up-to-date published product information and data sheets provided by the manufacturers and the most recent codes of conduct and safety regulation. The publisher and the authors make no representations or warranties to listeners, express or implied, as to the accuracy or completeness of this material. Without limiting the foregoing, the publisher and the authors make no representations or warranties as to the accuracy or efficacy of the drug doses mentioned in the material. The authors and the publisher do not accept and expressly disclaim any responsibility for any liability, loss, or risk that may be claimed or incurred as a consequence of the use and/or application of any of the contents of this material. Introduction to Human Flourishing in an Age of Gene Editing. Erik Parens and Josephine Johnston. In 2015, in the journal Science, a highly regarded group of scientists, science policy experts, and ethicists called for a public conversation about the ethical questions raised by a new technology that could be used to alter the genomes of human beings. Among these ethical questions were ones regarding safety. Most simply, could the new technology be deployed without posing an unreasonable risk of causing physical harms? The authors of the commentary in Science also alluded to broader ethical questions that have been raised ever since the 1970s, when it first seemed it would be possible to use gene transfer technologies to alter human genomes. These broader questions have nothing to do with medically detectable harms to people's bodies. Might such technologies push us toward thinking of human beings in increasingly mechanistic terms? Might they push us toward ever narrower conceptions of acceptable ways to be human? Might they undermine healthy relationships between parents and children? Might they exacerbate the obscene gap between the haves and have-nots? These harms are non-physical in the sense that they wouldn't immediately diminish the functioning of any bodily system. Rather, if they occurred, they would be harms to what we can call people's psyches. They would do harm to people's experience of being persons. They would threaten relationships and strain communities. The broadest form of the question concerning non-physical harms is, might this technology be used in ways that would inadvertently thwart human flourishing? That is the question motivating this book. But saying what we mean when we say we're worried about non-physical harms in general, and about flourishing in particular, is much harder than saying what we mean when we say we're worried about physical harms. And it is that harder task we have set for ourselves in this volume. We aim for this collection to serve as a resource for people, including those who are not familiar with the formal study of bioethics, to engage in the sort of public conversation called for by the authors of the commentary in Science. It is through this public conversation that citizens can influence laws and the distribution of funding for science and medicine, that professional leaders can shape understanding and use gene editing and related technologies by scientists, patients, and practitioners, and that individuals can make decisions about their own lives and the lives of their families. What we mean by an age of gene editing. The specific technology that precipitated the science commentary is called CRISPR-Cas9, and in 2012 it was unveiled as the first in a series of so-called gene editing technologies. These gene editing technologies marked a huge leap forward in researchers' ability to engage in what, since at least the 1970s, has been called genetic engineering. Whereas the older technologies only allowed researchers to transfer copies of whole genes to targeted genomes, the newer gene editing technologies allow them to make changes to as large or as small a part of a gene as they desire. The newer gene editing technologies also enable researchers to make such changes far more easily, cheaply, and reliably than was possible with the old-fashioned gene transfer technology. The technical details regarding CRISPR-Cas9 and related gene editing technologies are complicated, but the basic idea is simple. These technologies can be programmed to target and then cut one or more specific stretches of DNA. The targeted gene can be shut off, deleted, or new DNA can be pasted in. Although CRISPR gene editing technologies are far more accurate than previously available tools, they can accidentally cause unintended or off-target changes or fail to make all hoped-for changes, resulting in a mixture of edited and unedited cells within an organism, otherwise known as mosaicism. For an excellent written introduction to the technical details, you might consult Chapter 3 of the 2017 National Academy of Science report on gene editing. Numerous video introductions to the scientific details of CRISPR technologies can be found on the Internet. The ethical conversation about gene-altering technologies, whether of the old-fashioned gene transfer variety or the newer gene editing variety, has traditionally employed some basic distinctions. One of those regards the difference between efforts to alter genomes in somatic cells and efforts to alter genomes in germ cells. If the DNA in germ cells, including sperm, eggs, and early embryos, is altered, those alterations appear not only in the DNA of the people who are created from those cells, but also in those people's children. In contrast, if the DNA in somatic cells, all the cells in the body that aren't germ cells, is altered, those alterations are not passed on to future generations. Another of those basic distinctions seeks to draw a line between treatment and enhancement uses of gene editing technologies. In the case of treatment, a disease-causing bit of the genome is deleted or silenced, with possibly a healthy bit pasted in. In contrast, we can imagine efforts to use the same technology to enhance some human trait, where a healthy bit of the genome is cut out and a better-than-healthy bit pasted in. In principle, gene editing could be used to alter the somatic cells of living persons to enhance their traits, and it could also be used to alter germ cells to enhance the traits of future persons. Efforts of the latter sort are referred to as germline genetic enhancement, and, if attempted, would be the most ethically controversial application of gene editing technology. Those observers, however, who think it would be an ethical mistake to attempt germline genetic enhancement can find some comfort in knowing that, for the foreseeable future, It will likely be very difficult to achieve such interventions with respect to the traits that human beings in our society seem to care about most. The more we know about the staggeringly complex ways in which genes interact with each other and the environment to produce the sorts of enhancements that people might want most for themselves or their children, say more intelligence, more musical ability, or more resilience, the less likely it seems that it will be possible to produce such traits by editing genes. That is, in practice, CRISPR technologies may not provide the level of control over the shape of our children and ourselves that critics dread and enthusiasts desire. But this volume is not about any one technology, and it does not assume that it will be technically feasible to achieve the fabulous level of control that would be required to produce children who are more intelligent, musical, or resilient. Rather, it is about a large set of technologies that coexist with gene editing and are sometimes called reprogenetic, and it is about the increased level of control over the genetic makeup of our children that these technologies are already beginning to provide. The phrase, "in an age of gene editing," in our title is meant to indicate that, while gene editing may be an emblematic technology for the time we live in, it is but one of many related technologies, all of which raise the same set of ethical issues. Among the other technologies pertinent to our reflections here are pre-implantation genetic diagnosis and prenatal genetic testing. Pre-implantation genetic diagnosis allows a person who wants to become pregnant to choose which of several embryos with different genomic profiles she wants to have transferred to her uterus. Prenatal genetic testing enables people who are already pregnant to choose whether to bring a fetus with a given genomic profile to term. Neither pre-implantation genetic diagnosis nor prenatal genetic testing provides the level of control over the genetic makeup of the child-to-be that is dreamt of by some would-be gene editors, but all of these techniques share the aspiration to increase control over the shape of future generations. It is that aspiration to control, and what it means for the prospects of human flourishing, that we reflect on in this volume. What we mean by flourishing. When we use the English word flourishing in the title of this volume, we are thinking of it as a translation of the ancient Greek word eudaimonia, which Aristotle used to name what he said all human beings want. Other common translations of eudaimonia are well-being and happiness. According to Aristotle, human beings don't want to flourish because they think that flourishing will get them something else, like, say, power or money. Flourishing, or happiness or well-being, is what humans want for the sake of itself. It isn't a means for achieving some other end that humans desire. It is the desired end that they desire. People want to flourish because they want to flourish. So what more can we say about the meaning of flourishing that is a bit less abstract? It can help to start by distinguishing flourishing from health. Everyone wants to be healthy, but people don't want health for the sake of itself. They want to be healthy so that they can engage in activities that they find meaningful. They want to be at work in, engaged with, the world. For many human beings, those meaningful activities include engaging in various forms of loving relationships and in various forms of work. As we try to get a bead on what we mean by flourishing or well-being or happiness, it's important to notice that we are not talking about a psychological state, say, of the sort people would expect to enjoy if they won the lottery or got a job promotion or received a rave review. We're talking about an experience of being engaged in activities in the world that people find meaningful, which can actually entail temporarily painful psychological states. Being in loving relationships entails negotiating inevitable and sometimes painful conflicts, and too often entails the excruciating pain of losing to death the people we love. To be engaged in meaningful work can require sacrificing time that might be spent in other activities that would entail temporarily pleasurable psychological states. Yet both are paradigmatic instances of flourishing. Flourishing is the experience of being fully alive, exercising whatever particular set of capacities we were thrown into the world with. And as several contributors to this volume will remind you, flourishing depends less on the particular capacities that one has than on one's opportunities for exercising them. A corollary of that view is that using genetic technologies in attempts to shape our children's capacities is less urgent than the even more difficult, if less costly, business of creating environments in which people can exercise whatever capacities they have. The idea that achieving more control over the nature of children might not always promote their flourishing or that of their parents might sound strange at first, but that is one of the central claims we are exploring in this volume. Acceptance can conduce to flourishing. In the first section of our book, 3 authors open up the discussion from very different levels and perspectives, previewing themes and questions taken up in subsequent chapters. English professor and bioethicist Rosemarie Garland Thompson, writing from her and others' experience of disability, argues that for a greater openness to the fact that people with all sorts of bodies can flourish magnificently. She argues that to promote flourishing, instead of changing bodies or genes, individuals and societies should invest in changing environments in ways that make them more welcoming of different kinds of bodies. Philosopher Daniel Habron introduces a very brief history of the idea of flourishing in the West before exploring the significance for human well-being of authenticity, a value that is arguably at stake when considering altering genomes to enhance human capacities. Sociologist John Evans offers a history of the way in which some prominent thinkers about public policy have, lamentably, discounted concerns about human flourishing. In the next section of the book, 3 contributors pick up an argument introduced by Garland Thompson, that one way to promote human flourishing is to honor the stance of, or attitude of, what might be called acceptance. We say might be called acceptance for at least 2 reasons. First, the word acceptance can have a connotation of passivity, which is not what our authors intend. Accepting what is requires attention and energy. Second, acceptance might not perfectly capture the resonance of being grateful for or affirming what is, which some, if not all, of our authors do intend. Those caveats aside, acceptance is not a bad term to name the attitude or stance toward our children and ourselves that the authors in this volume are converging on. We should add that while we are converging on a defense of the attitude or stance of acceptance, they are surely not absolutist in that defense. They are doing no more or less than offering what they take to be a critique of the status quo, where the status quo assumes that more control or more shaping is better. They are making the claim that if human beings could become less preoccupied with transforming the bodies of themselves and their children, they might flourish more. Philosopher Michael Hauskeller makes an argument that expands the notion of acceptance to the notion of cherishing. If people can learn to cherish children and the world as they are, as opposed to how people might think they should be, everyone would flourish more. Whereas Hauskeller draws on the insights of Western philosophy, Richard Kim draws on the insights of Eastern philosophy to make the case for learning to let things be. And philosopher Gregory Kabnick explains that while the case for accepting nature as we find it is under constant challenge today, that case can be made with intellectual integrity, and it warrants respect. Choice and control can be overrated. To endorse the value of acceptance is, of course, to run up against one of Western culture's fundamental articles of belief, that more choice is good. From 3 different angles, our contributors challenge that belief. Psychologist Sheena Iyengar and her collaborator Tucker Kuhlman, a former member of her Columbia Research Lab, write on the large empirical psychological literature regarding choice, arguing that it simply is not true that more choice leads to more flourishing. They offer the figure of the inverted U-shaped curve to describe the relationship between choice and sense of well-being. Sense of well-being does increase with more choice, but only up to a point where more choice is associated with a decreased sense of well-being. Bioethicist and lawyer and co-editor of this volume, Josephine Johnston, explores the possibility that good parents will, with a view to promoting their own flourishing, sometimes choose against availing themselves of the panoply of technological options on offer. Along very similar lines, philosophers Nicole A. Vincent and Emma A. Jane argue that choosing to use reprogenetic technologies to shape one's children should be an option, but in no way a requirement for people who aspire to be good parents. Seeking balance between competing values. If we lived in a culture where there was too much emphasis on the ethical value of acceptance, this volume would have emphasized the need to remember the ethical value of shaping. But the contributors to this volume agree that in this cultural movement there is a bias toward the goodness of intervention and the value of controlling the shape of oneself and one's progeny. And for that reason, they are making the case for the goodness of eschewing intervention and for accepting our children and ourselves as we've been thrown into the world. It is essential to notice, however, that no one in this volume is arguing that acceptance is an absolute or ultimate value. Indeed, their point isn't that there is a single ethical value to be embraced, but a balance to be achieved between important ethical values that push in different directions. They are arguing for a better balance between control and acceptance, a point one of us, Erik Parens, has sought to elaborate previously. 4 of our contributors from very different angles make the case for balance. Sociologist Jackie Leach Scully, drawing on interviews with lay people in the United Kingdom, suggests that they, often much better than many professional bioethicists, recognize the profound importance of balancing commitments to control and acceptance when thinking about reprogenetic technologies. Philosopher Rob Sparrow is deeply impressed by the argument from the disability rights community that accepting the fact of genetic diversity is important, and he also cautions against taking that argument too far. Not all genomic diversity deserves to be conserved. Michael Burdett, who does research in religion, science, and technology, explains that mainline Christianity holds the ethical commitments to acceptance and to shaping in a fruitful tension. Burdett invites people to learn that they needn't choose between, but ought rather balance those commitments. One of us, Parens, would argue that Judaism also seeks such a balance and would guess that any religious or cultural tradition that endures has to honor both commitments. Theologian Celia Dean Drummond offers an extended explication of the virtue of practical wisdom as a tool for finding the sort of balance that is required to deploy a technology like gene editing. Seeing the bigger picture. The contributors to this volume acknowledge that gene editing, in working at the level of DNA, can do much good to advance human health. But they also want to say that, to promote human flourishing, human beings need to get much better at working at the level of the social. To promote more flourishing, societies need to get exceedingly better at building environments that support people with whatever genome they happen to have. And our contributors are suggesting building such environments will sometimes have to be accompanied by the articulation of some limits on the uses to which technologies like gene editing are put. In her essay, lawyer, bioethicist, and race studies scholar Dorothy Roberts argues that a real commitment to the flourishing of the most disadvantaged members in society wouldn't look first to genomics, but to building social environments that are more supportive of more people. Philosopher Martja Schirmer explains how the Dutch, in balancing the value of self-determination, held so dear in the United States, and the value of solidarity, held far less dearly, accept limits on some reprogenetic services that are made available. That is, the Dutch make peace with the fact that if to make basic reprogenetic testing available to everyone, they are not going to make non-basic forms of testing available to anyone, regardless of ability to pay. Anthropologist and scholar of science studies Gaiman Bennett describes the development of the idea of human dignity and argues for deploying a rich conception of it to recognize and redress the powerful forces promoting the uses of technologies like gene editing. Finally, political theorist and bioethicist Bruce Jennings argues that to create just and sustainable environments that can support human flourishing requires a better understanding of the philosophical underpinnings of the view that gives technologies like gene editing such a prominent place in society. He argues that doing so can help people cultivate the values of humility and restraint, which can seem to be in short supply in our age of gene editing. Public oversight and public conversation. The contributors to this volume all think that public conversation about flourishing is deeply important for making good public policy. And we are aware that citizens of democracies can resist engaging in such conversation for good reasons and for bad ones. A good reason is the desire to honor individual liberty. Public conversation about what human flourishing consists of for human beings in general can lead to constraining the liberty of individuals who have minority conceptions of what that concept means. A bad reason is the notion that conceptions of human flourishing are too speculative or nebulous to inform public policy. In fact, the question isn't whether conceptions of human flourishing can inform public policy. They frequently do. Though hardly the only, one of the reasons that policymakers make the policies they do is to promote the flourishing of their constituents as they understand it. So the real question is whether policymakers and others are willing to be explicit about what their conception is or would prefer to leave it implicit. Plainly, the contributors to this volume want more explicit talk. But how might more explicit public conversations about human flourishing and non-physical harms inform public policy? Is there, for example, a way to directly plug such concerns into a public oversight mechanism responsible for a new technology like gene editing? To briefly respond to that question, it helps to consider some historical context. The summit in Napa, California, out of which came the 2015 commentary in Science mentioned in the beginning of this introduction, was a sort of sequel to a summit that occurred in Pacific Grove, California in 1975. The 1975 summit, referred to as the Asilomar Conference because it was held at the Asilomar Conference Center in Pacific Grove, occurred in the wake of the discovery.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?